It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to their neighbors every morning. There was no rush, no chaos, just the slow rhythm of small-town life. That is, until the day 13-year-old Clara Bennett disappeared. It was a typical autumn morning, the leaves on the trees just beginning to turn a fiery red and orange, hinting at the colder days ahead. Clara, like she did every school day, woke up early, had breakfast with her parents, and headed out the door with her backpack slung over her shoulder. She was supposed to catch the bus to school at the usual stop, just a 5-minute walk from her home. But on that cool October morning, Clara never made it to the bus stop. By noon, when Clara's mother, Susan Bennett, received the automated call from Maplewood Middle School notifying her that Clara hadn't shown up for class, she felt a flicker of concern. At first, she thought maybe Clara had missed the bus and decided to walk to school. But as the hours ticked by and Clara still hadn't returned home, that flicker of concern turned into full-blown panic. Paul Bennett, Clara's father, rushed home from work as soon as he heard. By the time he arrived, Susan was pacing anxiously in the living room, her phone in hand, desperately trying to call their daughter. Every call went straight to voicemail. "She's just out of range," Paul tried to reassure her, though the worry in his voice was unmistakable. But deep down, both of them knew something was terribly wrong. The police were called immediately. Maplewood's sheriff, Ethan Granger, took the call himself. He had been in law enforcement for more than 20 years and had served as Maplewood's sheriff for the last decade. In all that time, he had never dealt with a missing child case like this. Maplewood was a quiet, peaceful town. Sure, there were the occasional disputes or petty thefts, but nothing ever truly dangerous. Yet, something about Clara's disappearance sent a chill down his spine. Granger mobilized his small team of deputies right away. They began by questioning neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Clara that morning. One woman mentioned seeing her leave the house, waving goodbye to her parents, but after that, nothing. No one had seen her walking along the street. No one had seen her get on the school bus. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The first few days after Clara disappeared were a whirlwind of activity. Volunteers from the town joined the search, combing through the nearby woods, looking for any sign of the missing girl. Posters with Clara's smiling face were plastered on every lamppost, telephone pole, and storefront. Her picture circulated on social media with pleas from the Bennett family asking for anyone who knew something to come forward. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Clara. Sheriff Granger sat in his office one evening, reviewing the case files spread out in front of him. He had gone over them a dozen times, but there was nothing, no clues, no evidence, no witnesses. Clara had simply disappeared without a trace. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone in town knew more than they were letting on, but there was nothing concrete to go on. The Bennetts, devastated and exhausted, were clinging to the hope that their daughter would come home. But that hope was beginning to dwindle. Susan hadn't slept in days, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Paul spent his days pacing the house, staring at the phone, willing it to ring with some good news. But every time it did, it was just another dead-end lead. Granger's instincts told him to start looking closer to home, at the people in the town. Maplewood was a small, insular community, and he knew most of the residents personally. But that also meant he knew that people often hid their darkest secrets behind closed doors. The first person who caught his attention was Henry Mills, a reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of town. Henry had always been a bit of an oddball, quiet, kept to himself, and didn't interact much with others. Years ago, there had been rumors about him and a teenage girl who had gone missing for a few hours but was later found unharmed. No charges were filed, but the whispers never quite went away. Granger visited Henry at his old, run-down house that sat at the edge of the woods. The place looked as isolated and unwelcoming as Henry himself. When Granger knocked on the door, Henry opened it just a crack, peering out suspiciously. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice gruff. Granger explained he was following up on Clara Bennett's disappearance and asked Henry a few questions. Henry denied knowing anything about Clara or her whereabouts and claimed he hadn't left his house in days. Granger took note of the man's disheveled appearance and nervous demeanor, but without any evidence, he couldn't do much. Still, Henry remained at the back of Granger's mind. As the investigation progressed, another name surfaced: Stephen Nash. Nash was the school bus driver, and he had been driving the route that Clara should have taken that day. He was the last person who might have seen her. Nash had been working in Maplewood for nearly 10 years, and while he had a reputation for being quiet and keeping to himself, he was well respected by most of the town. But when Granger interviewed him, something about Nash didn't sit right. He seemed overly nervous, his hands trembling as he answered the sheriff's questions. When asked if he had seen Clara that morning, Nash hesitated before replying, No, I didn't see her." Granger pressed him further, asking about his route and if he had noticed anything unusual that day. Nash's answers were vague and inconsistent. He said he hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. But when Granger asked him to recount his route in detail, Nash seemed to falter, stumbling over his words. Granger's suspicion grew, but there was no solid evidence to tying Nash to Clara's disappearance, just a gut feeling. With no witnesses or physical proof, Nash remained free, though he was now on Granger's radar. Weeks turned into months, and the trail grew colder. The media attention on Clara's case began to fade, though the people of Maplewood had not forgotten. Every time they passed a missing persons poster with Clara's smiling face, they were reminded of the tragedy that had shaken their peaceful town. Then, one chilly evening in December, there was a breakthrough. A local hiker named Jack Thompson had been walking through the dense woods near Maplewood when he stumbled upon something odd: a small, torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was bright pink, the same color as the jacket Clara had been wearing the day she disappeared. Jack immediately called the sheriff's department, and within hours, Granger and his team were at the scene. The area where the fabric was found was remote, far from any main roads or trails. Granger's heart raced as he scoured the surrounding area, and soon they found a backpack, Clara's backpack. Inside were some of her school books, a water bottle, and a few personal items. But the most significant find was a single strand of long blonde hair, caught in the zipper of the bag. DNA tests later confirmed it belonged to Clara. This discovery reignited the investigation, and Granger knew they were getting closer. The area was carefully combed for more clues, but it was the break they needed. Granger's focus immediately returned to Nash. His bus route had passed near the woods where the backpack was found, and though Nash had denied seeing Clara that day, the sheriff was convinced he was hiding something. Granger dug deeper into Nash's past. What he found was disturbing. Years before he moved to Maplewood, Nash had been questioned in another town over the disappearance of a young girl. The girl was eventually found unharmed, but Nash's involvement had always been questionable. The case was closed due to lack of evidence, but Granger knew he had to act. It wasn't long before Nash's behavior became erratic. He stopped showing up for work, and one of his neighbors reported seeing him hurriedly pack up his car in the middle of the night. Granger put out an alert, and the hunt for Nash began. But before they could track him down, Nash disappeared just like Clara. For weeks, there was no sign of him. Granger's frustration grew as the case seemed to stall yet again. But then, in early February, the sheriff received a tip from a small town nearly 100 miles away. A man matching Nash's description had been spotted working at a local diner using a different name. Granger wasted no time and, along with his deputies, traveled to the town. When they arrived, Nash was there, sitting in the back of the diner, sipping coffee as if nothing was wrong. Granger and his team arrested him on the spot. During his interrogation, Nash tried to maintain his innocence, but the evidence was stacking up against him. Under pressure, he finally cracked. He admitted to abducting Clara that morning, luring her into his bus by claiming there had been a change in the route. He had taken her to a remote cabin in the woods, where he had kept her for several days before panicking. Nash confessed to killing Clara and burying her body deep in the woods, far from where her belongings were found. Following Nash's confession, a search team was sent out to recover Clara's remains. It took days of combing through the dense forest, but eventually they found her. Clara's family was devastated, but they finally had the closure they had been waiting for. Nash was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but for the Bennetts and the people of Maplewood, the pain of losing Clara would never truly go away. The town, once so full of warmth and trust, was now scarred by the tragedy. Parents no longer let their children walk to school alone, and the quiet streets of Maplewood seemed a little darker, a little less safe. As for Sheriff Granger, the case had taken its toll on him as well. He had solved the mystery, but at a great cost. Still, he remained determined to protect the people of Maplewood, knowing that in a world where anything could happen, even in the safest of places, his job was more important than ever. It was a quiet afternoon on April 10th, 2017, in the quaint town of Eldor Heights when everything took a dark and unexpected turn. Evan Carter, alongside his wife Lila and their young daughter, had planned a routine visit to return a borrowed lawnmower to his close friend and business partner Ryan Moore. Evan had no idea that this seemingly mundane errand would soon unravel into a nightmare. As they approached Ryan's house, something felt amiss. No one answered the front door, despite Ryan's car being parked outside. An unsettling feeling gnawed at Evan's gut. His wife Lila, equally concerned, followed him as they circled around to the back. The service door was ajar. Inside the house, chaos reigned. The living room was a disaster, with items strewn about in disarray. Lila called out Ryan's name, but there was only silence. Growing more anxious, Evan led the way into the basement. And there, in the dim basement light, lay Ryan's lifeless body, a sight so gruesome it would haunt Evan and Lila forever. Evan Carter's life was fairly ordinary until the age of 25, when a chance encounter altered its course. At a friend's birthday party, Evan met Lila, a single mother of 3 children. Lila's warmth and strength immediately drew Evan to her, and within a week, he confessed to his own mother that he had found the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Despite concerns from some of Evan's friends warning him of the responsibilities that came with marrying a woman with 3 children, Evan was determined. His love for Lila was deep, and he embraced her children like his own. To support his growing family, Evan took on grueling work, eventually enrolling in training to become a welder. It was during this training that Evan met Ryan Moore, a charismatic man who had also switched careers from his previous job as a banker. Ryan's struggles growing up were not unlike Evan's. Coming from a conservative family in the rural town of Carthage, Ryan faced a lot of judgment for his choices and lifestyle. But he had persevered and built a successful career. Ryan's resilience and humor immediately clicked with Evan, and their friendship blossomed quickly. Before long, Ryan was more than a business partner to Evan. He was like family. He was especially close to Evan's children, who affectionately called him Uncle Ryan. By 2017, Evan and Ryan had been running a successful construction business together for years. On the surface, life was good. Evan had a strong marriage, a thriving business, and a close friendship with Ryan. But unknown to Evan, a sinister secret was brewing beneath the surface. That fateful day, as Evan stared in shock at Ryan's body in the basement, he couldn't comprehend what had happened. Lila, frantic, immediately dialed 911, and within minutes police were on the scene. When officers arrived, they found Evan and Lila outside the house, visibly shaken and in disbelief. Evan, barely able to speak, explained how they had come to return a lawnmower to Ryan. He told them that Ryan was not only a friend but a partner in his business, someone deeply involved in their families' lives. As detectives combed through the house, they immediately noticed signs of a struggle. The house looked ransacked, with open drawers and items scattered across the floor. At first, they suspected a robbery gone wrong, but the absence of missing valuables made that theory seem unlikely. The television remained, money was found on the floor, and Ryan's collection of expensive art was untouched. What seemed like a tragic, inexplicable murder soon turned into something far more complicated. As the investigation unfolded, Evan and Lila gave their statements to the police. Lila shared that they had spent many holidays with Ryan, who had been like an uncle to their children. They were planning a family vacation to Mexico with him later that summer. But the detectives sensed something was off. During initial questioning, Evan and Lila both mentioned that Ryan had recently been having issues with a former business partner, Kyle Anderson, who had left their company under strained circumstances. Kyle's departure had been marked by frequent arguments and disagreements, which Lila recalled Ryan discussing in frustration several times. The police followed up on this lead and discovered that Kyle had an alibi, ruling him out as a suspect. The investigation, which seemed to be going nowhere, took a dramatic turn when Ryan's cousin revealed a startling piece of information. 2 days after the murder, detectives interviewed Ryan's cousin, Ellie Moore, who told them that Ryan had recently confided in her about a disturbing secret. Ryan had been having an affair with someone very close to him. Ellie hesitated but eventually admitted that the man in question was Evan Carter, his best friend and business partner. The detectives were stunned. They had seen no sign of anything but a strong friendship between the two men. But Ellie was insistent. Ryan had told her that the affair had been going on for over a year. Ryan had fallen in love with Evan, and although Evan had promised to leave his wife for him, the situation had become strained. Detectives now viewed Evan in a different light. His initial grief and shock at finding Ryan's body no longer seemed entirely genuine. Could it be that this wasn't just a random murder, but something far more personal? The police moved quickly. Under the guise of needing to retrieve phone data to help with the investigation, they seized Evan's phone. Forensic analysis revealed deleted text messages between Evan and Ryan, confirming their romantic relationship. The texts painted a picture of a secret affair that Evan had been desperate to keep hidden, especially from his wife, Lila. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's house added more damning evidence. It showed Evan arriving at Ryan's house in the late afternoon, shortly before the estimated time of the murder. Strangely, Evan had driven his wife's car instead of his own, which detectives found suspicious. Even more concerning was the fact that the footage showed Evan returning hours later with his family, under the pretense of delivering a lawnmower. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, detectives were now convinced that Evan had been involved in Ryan's death. They confronted him with the evidence. During interrogation, Evan broke down. After hours of denying any involvement, he finally admitted to being at Ryan's house that day, but his story was full of contradictions. He first claimed that a mysterious third person had been at the house and had killed Ryan in a fit of rage. But when pressed, he changed his story several times. Eventually, Evan confessed to the affair. He told detectives that Ryan had been pressuring him to leave his wife, threatening to reveal their secret if he didn't. On the day of the murder, Ryan had confronted him, and a heated argument ensued. Evan claimed that Ryan had pulled a gun on him, and in the struggle that followed, Evan shot Ryan twice, once in the back of the head and once while he was on the ground. But the forensic evidence didn't support Evan's claim of self-defense. The autopsy revealed that Ryan had been shot twice, execution style, in the back of the head. There was no indication of a struggle. Realizing the severity of the situation, Evan panicked. That same night, after returning home and trying to act normal around his family, the weight of what he had done began to crush him. His thoughts raced. If the police found out about the affair, everything he had built with Lila and the children would come crashing down. The guilt of Ryan's death was only overshadowed by the terror of being caught. In a moment of desperation, Evan made a split-second decision: he needed to run. In the middle of the night, while Lila and the children slept, Evan packed a bag with clothes and cash and left a vague note saying he needed some time away to clear his head. He drove his truck as far as he could without raising suspicion, heading toward a distant city where he thought he could start over. His destination, Silver Lake, a sprawling city known for its anonymity and a place Evan believed would provide the perfect cover. For weeks, Evan managed to stay under the radar in Silver Lake. He rented a cheap apartment under a fake name, working odd jobs to keep himself afloat. But the constant fear of being recognized gnawed at him. He avoided public places, made no friends, and spent most of his time laying low, watching the news to see if the police were still searching for him. Meanwhile, back in Eldor Heights, the investigation into Ryan's murder hadn't stopped. The police had pieced together enough evidence to issue a warrant for Evan's arrest. His sudden disappearance only confirmed their suspicions that he was responsible for Ryan's death. The detectives, determined to bring him to justice, expanded their search beyond Eldor Heights, circulating his photo and name across multiple states. Months passed, and Evan began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had escaped justice. But his paranoia never fully left him. One evening, while working at a local mechanic's shop, a customer recognized him from a news report. She quickly left the shop and called the authorities, not entirely sure it was him, but her gut told her otherwise. The call was enough for the police to act. A team of officers was dispatched to the mechanic's shop, and they staked out the area for days, watching Evan's movements, confirming his identity. One evening, as Evan left the shop and headed toward his apartment, he noticed several unmarked cars parked along the street. His heart raced. He knew the police had found him. Panicking, Evan took off, running through alleyways and darting through the narrow streets of Silver Lake. But the police had already surrounded the area, anticipating his flight. As Evan sprinted toward the city's outskirts, officers closed in, cutting off his escape route. With nowhere left to run, Evan was tackled to the ground by the pursuing officers. He fought, kicking and screaming, as they restrained him, but it was over. The life he had tried to escape from had finally caught up with him. Evan was extradited back to Eldor Heights, where he was charged with first-degree murder, fleeing from justice, and obstruction of investigation. His trial became a media sensation, with the prosecution presenting overwhelming evidence of his guilt: the surveillance footage, the text messages, the affair, and the damning forensic findings. The defense argued that Evan had acted in a moment of fear, claiming that Ryan had threatened him and that the shooting was a desperate act of self-defense. But the jury didn't buy it. After a short deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict. Evan Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife, Lila, devastated by the betrayal, filed for divorce shortly after the trial concluded. Ryan's family, heartbroken over their loss, expressed relief that justice had been served, though the pain of Ryan's death would never fully heal. In the end, Evan's desperate attempt to flee from the consequences of his actions only prolonged his inevitable downfall. What began as a tragic story of love, betrayal, and murder ended with a life destroyed by guilt and a futile flight from justice. Greenwood was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other. Alex, a 17-year-old, lived there with his family. He was smart and curious, with a close bond to his father, David, who worked as a sheriff. Halloween was approaching, but something felt off. Alex had been acting distant lately, his usual energy dampened by something he wouldn't talk about. Unbeknownst to everyone, Alex had discovered a terrible secret. One evening, while visiting his Uncle Mark's house, Alex overheard a suspicious conversation. Mark was speaking on the phone in low tones, talking about a shipment and moving targets. Alex's heart raced as he realized the horrible truth: his uncle was involved in a kidnapping ring. Shocked and unsure of what to do, Alex left, but not before Mark noticed him. Alex was torn. Should he tell his father? He wrestled with the decision, knowing that exposing his uncle's secret could destroy their family. But the danger he was in was too great. Mark knew Alex had overheard, and Alex feared for his safety. As days passed, Alex grew more withdrawn, his mind consumed by the secret he carried. One evening, Alex didn't return home. His parents grew worried, but they assumed he was out with friends. As the hours dragged on, David's concern deepened. He knew something wasn't right. Alex wasn't the type to disappear without notice. Soon, David received the call every parent dreads. Alex had been reported missing. David launched a search, using every resource at his disposal. The entire town of Greenwood rallied around him, combing through forests, streets, and abandoned buildings. Days passed, and the search yielded nothing. David was heartbroken, but determined to find his son. What he didn't know was how close the mystery would lead him. David couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His mind was consumed with the thought of Alex. He retraced his son's last known steps, interviewing friends and family. That's when he noticed something strange. His brother-in-law, Mark, had been acting unusually nervous. David's instincts told him something was off. While searching near an abandoned factory, David found something that made his blood run cold: a bracelet. It was Alex's. The bracelet was half buried in the dirt, a grim clue that his son had been there. David knew this was no longer a search for a missing boy. It was now a murder investigation. With the bracelet in hand, David knew he had to confront Mark. He could no longer ignore the growing suspicion. When he visited Mark's house, he noticed his brother-in-law was anxious, avoiding eye contact. David's heart pounded as he asked the question he feared most: where is Alex? Under the weight of David's interrogation, Mark broke down. He confessed everything. Alex had overheard him speaking to a kidnapper, and Mark couldn't let him expose their operation. "I had no choice," Mark said coldly. He would have ruined everything. David's worst fears were realized. His own brother-in-law had murdered his son. Mark revealed more details, implicating a man named Lucas, a key member of the kidnapping ring. Together, they had been abducting teenagers and selling them in other cities. Alex had become a threat, and Mark eliminated him to keep their operation going. David was stunned, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. Mark confessed that he had taken Alex to the abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, where he murdered him and left his body to decompose. David's heart ached as he pictured his son's final moments, trapped and terrified. He could barely process the horror, but he knew he had to continue the investigation. Despite the emotional toll, David pressed on. He knew there was more to uncover, and Lucas needed to be brought to justice. Using the information Mark provided, David coordinated with other officers to track down Lucas. He couldn't rest until both men were held accountable for Alex's death. The search for Lucas led the authorities to another city. Lucas had gone into hiding, but David was determined. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated. The town of Greenwood watched as the case unfolded, the horror of Alex's murder hanging over the community like a dark cloud. Lucas had taken refuge in a rundown apartment complex. David and his team raided the building, storming through each room. When they finally found Lucas, he tried to flee, but there was no escape. He was arrested and brought back to Greenwood to face justice for his role in the kidnapping ring. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Mark sat expressionless as the charges were read aloud. David, sitting in the front row, felt a wave of anger and sadness. The evidence was overwhelming, but it didn't make the pain any easier. As the prosecution laid out their case, the full extent of Mark's betrayal became clear. Mark's defense team tried to paint him as a man who was forced into the kidnapping ring by Lucas, but the jury wasn't convinced. The cold, calculated nature of Alex's murder weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Mark had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. As Lucas took the stand, his involvement in the kidnapping ring became undeniable. He had been the mastermind behind the operation, manipulating people like Mark to do his dirty work. His lack of remorse only fueled the anger in the courtroom. Lucas's fate was sealed. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Both Mark and Lucas were found guilty of all charges, including the murder of Alex. The courtroom erupted in emotion, with David feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the hole left by Alex's death remained. On sentencing day, the judge handed down life sentences for both Mark and Lucas. There would be no parole, no chance for redemption. The weight of their crimes was too great to allow for any leniency. As the sentence was read, David felt a small sense of closure, knowing that his son's killers would never walk free. David's family struggled to move on after the trial. The loss of Alex was compounded by the betrayal from within their own family. Holidays, once filled with laughter and joy, became somber occasions. They leaned on each other for support, but the scars ran deep. The town of Greenwood also began the long process of healing. Memorials for Alex were set up, and the community came together to support his family. But the sense of security that once defined the town was gone. People were more cautious, more guarded, knowing that evil could lurk anywhere. David spent many nights reflecting on the case and his own role in it. He had always believed in justice, but nothing could prepare him for the emotional toll of investigating his own son's murder. He wrestled with guilt, wondering if he could have done more to protect Alex, but he knew he had done all he could. In time, David found a new purpose in life. He became an advocate for families of crime victims, using his experience to help others navigate the painful process of losing a loved one to violence. It gave him a sense of peace, knowing that he could turn his tragedy into something meaningful. Mark, now serving his life sentence, began to feel the weight of his actions. The cold, calculated decisions he had made came back to haunt him. In letters to David, he expressed regret, but David never responded. For him, Mark's remorse meant nothing in the face of Alex's death. Lucas, however, remained unrepentant. He continued to deny any wrongdoing, even as he spent the rest of his life behind bars. His lack of remorse was a stark contrast to the devastation he had caused, but David found solace in knowing that Lucas would never harm anyone else again. As years passed, Alex's memory lived on in Greenwood. The town established a scholarship in his name, honoring his love of learning and his bright future that had been stolen away. David visited his son's grave regularly, finding comfort in the quiet moments spent remembering the boy he had loved so deeply. Though life would never be the same, David and his family found a way to move forward. The pain of Alex's loss would always be there, but they learned to live with it, finding strength in each other and in the memories of the happy times they shared. Justice had been served, and in time healing began.
Alderwood, a quaint town nestled in the shadows of towering pine forests, was the sort of place where time moved at its own pace. The town had been untouched by the hustle of the outside world, and its people lived in a rhythm that seemed almost eternal, until everything changed with the disappearance of Amelia Cross. Amelia was the town's sweetheart. At 25, she had her whole life ahead of her. She was married to Jonas Cross, a respected, if somewhat reclusive, man who had returned from years of military service to build a life for them and their young daughter, Lila. Their home sat on the outskirts of Alderwood, surrounded by woods and whispers, and those who visited often remarked how perfect their lives seemed. But perfection, as the town would soon learn, was just a fragile veneer, hiding darkness beneath its polished surface. It was a quiet afternoon when Amelia vanished. She had told Jonas that she was heading to the local market to pick up a few things for dinner, nothing out of the ordinary. She kissed Lila on the forehead, exchanged a smile with Jonas, and left. The sun hung low in the sky, casting soft golden light over the trees. The kind of light that made everything look peaceful. But as the shadows lengthened and the evening crept closer, something far less peaceful loomed over Alderwood. That evening, when the sun set and the shadows of Alderwood grew long, Amelia never returned. The worry started small. Jonas assumed Amelia had been delayed by some trivial matter. Perhaps she had run into an old friend or decided to take a detour through the woods, a habit she often indulged in to clear her mind. But as the hours stretched into the deep night, his concern turned into panic. He called the neighbors, his friends, anyone who might have seen her, but no one had. By the next morning, the town was buzzing with the news. Amelia was gone. Sheriff Jack Halford was called to lead the investigation. Jack was an experienced man, with a sharp eye for detail and a reputation for uncovering the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. Alderwood was a quiet town, and his usual work involved small disputes or the occasional lost pet. A disappearance like this was unusual, unsettling even. Jack visited the Cross home the day after Amelia's disappearance. Jonas greeted him with a face that looked as though it had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled Lila in his arms. He told Jack everything, how Amelia had left for the market and hadn't returned, how he'd waited and waited until he could no longer bear it. He looked like a man drowning in grief, but something about his demeanor bothered Jack. As Jack questioned him, Jonas's responses were short, as though each word was weighed down by some invisible burden. He repeated the same story. She went to the market, and that was it. When Jack asked him if anything unusual had happened lately, perhaps a disagreement or strange encounter, Jonas hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his head. No, everything was normal, he said. But the sheriff noted the brief pause. That night, as Jack sat in his office, going over the details of the case, something nagged at him. The town was small, people noticed things, and yet no one had seen Amelia after she left home. He decided to retrace her steps the next morning, starting with a local market. There had to be something they were missing. The following day, Jack and his deputy, Evelyn Carter, began canvassing the town. At the market, they spoke to the cashier, an elderly woman named Agnes, who had worked there for decades. She remembered seeing Amelia frequently, but couldn't recall her coming in on the day she disappeared. That was the first crack in the story Jonas had told. If Amelia had never reached the market, where had she gone? Days turned into a week, and the town's quiet streets were filled with whispers and speculation. Some believed Amelia had simply run away, tired of her life in the isolated town. Others suspected foul play, though no one could fathom who would harm such a kind and gentle soul. But Jack wasn't one to believe in coincidences, and something told him that this was no ordinary disappearance. Then, a breakthrough came. A local hiker named Daniel West, who often roamed the trails near the woods, stumbled upon something unusual, a scarf. It was pale blue, delicate, and unmistakably Amelia's. It had been caught on a branch near an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest, a place that most townsfolk avoided. Jack and Evelyn rushed to the scene. The cabin was ancient, long forgotten by everyone except for the occasional curious explorer. Its walls were crumbling, and the roof sagged in places, but there was something eerie about it. Something that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand up. They searched the area, calling out for Amelia, but there was no sign of her. Inside the cabin, they found only dust and decay. At first, it seemed like another dead end. But as Jack examined the cabin more closely, something caught his eye, a loose floorboard in the corner. Beneath it, he found an old, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages and realized, with a shock, that the journal belonged to Jonas. Its pages were filled with scattered thoughts, written in a messy, frantic hand. The entries began innocuously enough, notes about daily life, reflections on his time in the military. But as Jack read further, the entries became darker, more disjointed. Jonas wrote about his growing distrust of Amelia. He suspected her of keeping secrets, of lying to him. His paranoia bled through the words, each entry revealing a man spiraling deeper into madness. Jack's heart sank as he realized what this could mean. Was Jonas responsible for his own wife's disappearance? Jack returned to Jonas's home that evening, armed with the journal. When he confronted Jonas, the man's reaction was telling. His face went pale, and he stammered, trying to explain that the journal was just a reflection of his stress, that he loved Amelia and would never harm her. But Jack wasn't convinced. He had seen this before, the denial, the excuses. Something was very wrong. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details came to light. Evelyn discovered a video from a gas station near the edge of town. In the footage, Jonas was seen just hours after Amelia's disappearance, wearing different clothes than what he had described. He looked disheveled, anxious, and was seen filling his car with gas before driving off toward the woods. It was the evidence Jack needed. They brought Jonas in for questioning. At first, he stuck to his story, but under pressure his facade began to crumble. He admitted that he had gone to the woods that day, but only because he had been searching for Amelia. He claimed to have found her scarf and had panicked, not knowing what to do. But when Jack pressed him about the journal, about the entries that spoke of his growing distrust of his wife, Jonas fell silent. Finally, after hours of interrogation, Jonas broke. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed to what had really happened. He had confronted Amelia in the woods that afternoon, accusing her of infidelity. In his mind, she had been lying to him for months, hiding something from him. The argument had escalated, and in a moment of blind rage, he attacked her. But what Jonas didn't expect was for Oliver Slate, an old friend from his military days, to arrive at the scene. Oliver had been watching Jonas for weeks, concerned about his mental state. He had seen the toll that Jonas's paranoia was taking on him, and had decided to intervene. But by the time he reached the cabin, it was too late. Amelia was gone. Together, Jonas and Oliver had staged the scene to make it look like a random kidnapping, hoping to cover up what had happened. But their plan unraveled as the investigation dug deeper. Jonas was arrested, and Oliver, unable to face the consequences, fled town. The case had shaken Alderwood to its core. The town's quiet, peaceful facade had been shattered, revealing the darkness that had been festering beneath the surface. As Jack stood on the edge of the woods where Amelia had met her tragic end, he couldn't help but reflect on the fragility of human relationships. In the end, it wasn't an outsider who had brought tragedy to Alderwood, but one of their own. The town would never be the same, and neither would Jack. The shadows of Alderwood now seemed longer, darker, and more menacing than ever before. Amelia's death left a scar that would never fully heal, and the town of Alderwood would be forever haunted by the knowledge that even in the most serene and idyllic of places, the darkest secrets can still hide in plain sight. Months after Jonas's arrest, the town tried to move on, though it was never easy. Sheriff Jack Halford, once known for his unflappable demeanor, found himself haunted by the case. He replayed the events in his mind over and over again, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent the tragedy. Lila, too young to understand the depth of what had happened, was taken in by Amelia's parents, who moved away from Alderwood to escape the painful memories. As for the townsfolk, they spoke of Amelia in hushed tones, remembering her for the kindness she had shown and mourning the life she could have had. In the end, Alderwood remained what it had always been, a town of quiet, of whispers, of stories that were never fully told. And in that quiet, the memory of Amelia Cross lingered, forever a part of the woods, forever a part of the shadows. Sheriff Halford continued his duties, but the case of Amelia Cross left a permanent scar on his heart. His reputation as the town's protector was marred by the tragedy. Though the legal justice system had taken its course, it never felt complete to him. In the quiet of the night, he'd hear the wind howl through the trees, and sometimes he imagined he could hear Amelia's voice in the whispers of the forest, asking questions that no one could answer, calling for a truth that would never fully come to light. The abandoned cross house, now rotting on the outskirts of town, became a symbol of the tragic tale, a monument to love gone awry, to trust broken, and to the darkness that can dwell within even the most serene places. And Alderwood, though it returned to its peaceful rhythm, would never quite be the same. The shadows in the woods felt longer now, and in those shadows, the people of the town whispered stories of Amelia Cross, Jonas, and the tragic events that had forever changed their small, quiet world. In the quiet town of Elm Hollow, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, peace was a way of life. Neighbors knew each other by name, children played in the parks without worry, and the passage of seasons was marked by community gatherings. But that peace was shattered one cold autumn evening when the remains of a young woman, Sophie Archer, were discovered deep within the shadowy thickets of Briarwood Forest. Sophie had been missing for a week. Her last known appearance had been at the town's Grand Autumn Masquerade, an annual event that celebrated the harvest season. It was the highlight of the year, with townsfolk donning elaborate costumes, the streets lined with jack-o'-lanterns, and the central square filled with laughter and music. But amidst the revelry, Sophie had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the eerie silence of the night. Her costume, an intricate gown designed to resemble autumn leaves and forest vines, had taken her weeks to create. The last time her friends had seen her, she was glowing with excitement, determined to win the costume contest. But now, that beautiful creation was a haunting symbol of her brutal fate. Detective Rachel Hayes was the first to arrive at the scene. She had lived in Elm Hollow her entire life, and the discovery of Sophie's remains shook her to the core. Sophie wasn't just another missing person. She was someone Rachel had known since childhood. The small-town detective had handled her share of cases, but nothing like this. The brutal nature of the crime felt foreign, out of place in the sleepy town she had always called home. And as she stood there, looking down at what was left of Sophie, she couldn't help but wonder if the town would ever be the same again. Rachel was no stranger to difficult investigations, but this case felt different. It wasn't just the horror of the murder. It was something deeper, something darker that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Elm Hollow had its share of secrets, but nothing like this. As she began to gather evidence, it became clear that Sophie's death wasn't a random act of violence. The clues pointed to something more personal, more calculated. Sophie's friends, Emma, Liam, and Sarah, were devastated. They had all attended the autumn masquerade together, and the guilt weighed heavily on their hearts. Emma, Sophie's best friend since grade school, had been the last to see her that night. They had been laughing, joking about the cheesy costumes some of the partygoers were wearing. But at some point, amidst the music and dancing, they had lost track of each other. Emma had assumed Sophie had left with someone she knew, or maybe she had just wandered off to get some air. It wasn't unusual for Sophie to need a break from the crowd. Sarah, always the cautious one, remembered warning Sophie earlier in the evening. "Don't go into the woods alone," she had said, half joking, as they walked toward the bonfire that had been lit at the edge of Briarwood Forest. Sophie had laughed it off, saying she wasn't afraid of few shadows. But now, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she should have been more insistent. If only she had stayed closer, if only they hadn't let her wander off. Liam, quiet and thoughtful, had kept his distance at the party. He wasn't one for big crowds, and he had spent most of the evening by the bonfire, watching the flames dance against the night sky. He hadn't noticed Sophie leave, but now he regretted not paying more attention. The what-ifs played over and over in his mind, and the guilt gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. The town was in shock. Elm Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked, and children rode their bikes through the streets without fear. But now, a dark cloud had settled over the town, and no one knew who to trust. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it had been a drifter, someone passing through town. Others whispered about an old legend, a curse that was said to haunt the Briarwood forest. But Rachel didn't believe in legends or curses. She believed in evidence, and right now, there wasn't enough of it. The investigation started with the usual suspects, those who had attended the party, friends, acquaintances, anyone who had been in contact with Sophie in the days leading up to her disappearance. But each interview led to more dead ends. Witnesses claimed to have seen Sophie throughout the evening, mingling with the crowd, but no one could remember who she had been with when she left. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Then there was Daniel Rooker, a name that kept coming up in conversations. He was a relative newcomer to Elm Hollow, having moved into the old manor on the outskirts of town just a few months ago. The manor had a dark history, rumors of hauntings, mysterious deaths, and strange happenings, but Daniel dismissed the stories as small-town gossip. Still, his arrival had sparked curiosity, and now, with Sophie's death, suspicion. Rachel knew she had to question Daniel. He had been at the autumn masquerade, and his name kept surfacing in the most unexpected places. When she visited him at his home, he seemed nervous, evasive. He admitted that he had attended the party, but claimed he had left early, feeling out of place among the revelers. But when Rachel pressed him about why Sophie's blood had been found on the edge of his property, his story began to unravel. Daniel's alibi was shaky at best. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Sophie's death, but there was something about his demeanor that made Rachel uneasy. He was hiding something, she was sure of it, but without more concrete evidence, she couldn't make an arrest. So, she continued to dig, hoping that one of the many pieces of the puzzle would finally fall into place. Meanwhile, Sophie's parents, Beth and James Archer, were inconsolable. They had always been protective of their daughter, their only child, and the thought that something so terrible could happen to her in their own hometown was unimaginable. Beth had always worried about Sophie's free spirit, her tendency to trust people too easily, but she had never imagined that her worst fears would come true. James, a stoic man who rarely showed his emotions, was a shell of himself. He spent hours at the police station, demanding answers that no one could give. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to stall. Rachel felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The town was growing restless, and the fear that had taken hold was palpable. People began locking their doors at night, something that hadn't been done in years. Parents kept a closer eye on their children, and the once bustling town square was now eerily quiet. As Rachel combed through the evidence once again, she began to notice a pattern, a series of seemingly unrelated events that, when connected, painted a chilling picture. Sophie had been looking into something that had to do with the history of Elm Hollow. She had mentioned it to Emma a few weeks before the party, saying she had uncovered something big. At the time, Emma hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was just another one of Sophie's wild ideas. But now it seemed important. Rachel dug deeper into Sophie's life, talking to people who had known her well. She discovered that Sophie had been researching the history of Briarwood Forest and the old manor that Daniel had moved into. There were stories of disappearances, strange sightings, and even deaths that had occurred over the years, all centered around the manor and the forest. Sophie had been fascinated by the tales, and it seemed she had uncovered something that someone didn't want her to know. As Rachel pieced together the clues, she realized that Sophie's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was connected to the town's dark past. Someone had killed Sophie to keep the secrets of Elm Hollow buried. But who? And why now after all these years? The breakthrough came one cold November evening, when a witness came forward with a crucial piece of information. A local farmer who lived near the edge of Briarwood Forest had seen something strange the night Sophie disappeared. He had been out in his field, checking on his livestock, when he saw a figure moving through the woods, dragging something behind them. At the time, he had thought it was just one of the many festival-goers stumbling home after a night of drinking. But now, with the discovery of Sophie's body, he realized it had been something far more sinister. Rachel followed the lead, and it brought her back to Daniel Rooker. His story about leaving the party early didn't hold up under scrutiny. And when the police searched his property again, they found a hidden room in the basement of the old manor, a room filled with newspaper clippings, maps of the forest, and journals detailing the history of Elm Hollow. It was clear that Daniel had been obsessed with the town's past, and in particular, the strange events that had occurred around Briarwood Forest. But there was more to the story than just an interest in history. As Rachel read through the journals, she discovered that Daniel had been part of a group, an underground society that had existed in Elm Hollow for decades. Their purpose? To protect the town's secrets, no matter the cost. Sophie had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have, and Daniel had been tasked with making sure she never revealed what she had found. But it wasn't just Daniel. There were others involved, people who had been living in Elm Hollow for years, hiding in plain sight. With this new information, Rachel knew she had to act fast. She confronted Daniel, who finally confessed to being part of the society, but insisted that he hadn't killed Sophie. He claimed that it had been an accident, that Sophie had come to his house that night to confront him about what she had found, and in the struggle, she had fallen and hit her head. Panicked, he had taken her body to the forest, hoping that the elements would cover up what had happened. But Rachel wasn't convinced. There were too many inconsistencies in Daniel's story, and the involvement of the secret society suggested that Sophie's death had been planned, not accidental. As she continued to dig, she uncovered the names of the other members of the society, prominent figures in the town, people she had known her entire life. The truth was more horrifying than she had ever imagined. Sophie hadn't just been killed to keep a secret. She had been sacrificed, part of an ancient ritual that the society believed would protect Elm Hollow from the dark forces that supposedly haunted Briarwood Forest. With the help of a few trusted colleagues, Rachel was able to bring the members of the society to justice. The town was left reeling from the revelations, and the once peaceful community was forever changed.